I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar on the current biologics and biosimilars landscape in Canada. No, that's not right. Sorry, our today's webinar is titled Clinical Trials 101 and Clinical Trial Participation. We'll be joined today by Dawn Richards, Director of Patient and Public Engagement at Clinical Trials Ontario. And we've also gathered a panel of patients who have experience with clinical trials. They are Kathie LaForge, Eric Pitters, and James Davidson. The webinar will tell you what you need to know about clinical trials, their history, and help you prepare for a clinical trial. If you're currently considering participating in a clinical trial, we hope that this webinar helps to answer many of your questions. In the presentation, you'll learn the difference between different types of clinical trial and the design and purpose of clinical trials, and you'll get an inside look at the approval process. We'll also be hearing from our patient panel and asking them to share some of their experiences with clinical trials. We encourage you to direct any questions you have about clinical trials to our presenter, Dawn, or our panel. You can type the questions into the window on your right, and our moderator, Jared, will read them out to the presenters. We'd like to thank Amgen, Boehringer Ingelheim, Merck, and Novartis for the support of today's webinar. We very much appreciate their support of today's and other webinars. Now I'm going to hand over our webinar to our moderator and Dawn Richards, and we'll see you at the exit.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much, Mona, and others at the Canadian Cancer Survivor Network for inviting Clinical Trials Ontario to provide you with this overview about clinical trials. And then I'm happy that we're going to have a bit of a conversation with some individuals who have participated in clinical trials as well. So to start off with, I thought it would be helpful for me to set the stage for you about who Clinical Trials Ontario is, or CTO. So we were set up in about 2012. We are supported by the Ontario Ministry of Research, Innovation and Science. And our vision is to make Ontario a preferred location for global clinical trials, obviously while maintaining the highest ethical standards. Our mission is to strengthen, promote, and capitalize on Ontario's competitive advantages to conduct these high-quality clinical trials. We were partly established to address a decline in clinical trials in Ontario that's been noted, and to really leverage the strengths that Ontario has in terms of clinical research capabilities to actively attract more clinical trials to Ontario. We are very cognizant that clinical trials are an important part of the research process, and quite honestly, they're an important part in the health of Ontarians and in ensuring that Ontarians and beyond in Canada, people have access to new treatments as a result of their being in clinical trials and in clinical research. So briefly, we do have a strategic plan over 5 years that has really 3 main pillars. The first one here is called Streamline on the left-hand side, and this is what we've been really active in since our start in 2012. And as we'll talk about, clinical trials are complex, and we've undertaken some efforts to streamline the multiple processes around them to help support the timely, efficient, and more cost-effective conduct of high-quality clinical trials, is starting in Ontario because that's our focus, but we do work very collaboratively across the country as well. So we've been working really hard for a number of years now to streamline the research ethics review system in Ontario, especially for trials that have multiple sites involved. We'll talk about the research ethics review process in a little bit. And we've also been looking at other processes that we can help streamline, potentially around agreements and other areas as well. The second pillar in our strategic focus is really about engaging patients and the public with clinical trials. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So our focus here is really encouraging active involvement of the public with clinical trials. It doesn't always mean as a participant, but talking more about clinical trials as options through increasing public awareness, as well as supporting healthcare providers, again, to either talk about clinical trials, to help them find trials for people that they treat, or other resources that may be for healthcare providers. Our third pillar is really the promotion of Ontario and its competitive advantages to attract more investment in clinical trials within Ontario. And we won't talk too much about that today, but again, those are our three pillars: streamline, engage, and promote. So we're going to talk briefly, you may or may not know, but the concept of clinical trials goes back actually thousands of years. And it goes back into actually being recorded within the book of Daniel in the Bible. It was conducted by a king, and he had ordered his people to only eat, to only eat meat and wine, and he believed that this diet would keep his people in sound physical condition. However, there were a number of young men of royal blood who preferred to eat vegetables only and objected to this. And so the king allowed these so-called rebels to follow a vegetarian diet for 10 days. So he did a bit of an experiment with these individuals, and he compared the meat eaters with the vegetarians, and in his observations, he felt that the vegetarians appeared better nourished than the meat eaters, and as a result, he allowed them to continue their diet. So this is technically the world's first clinical trial, maybe not as we know them today. And I'll move on to show you what's really considered, I guess, the first modern clinical trial conducted by a physician who you may have heard about. His name was James Lind, and his is kind of the famous treatment of scurvy. So during the mid-1700s, there were a lot of exploration expeditions happening where sailors would be at sea for long periods of time. And there was an observation that they would often become very ill with scurvy, which would have various effects on their gums, teeth, their knees. And so what James Lind did was he did an experiment where he took a number of sailors, and I'll say he assigned them to different groups. So 2 were ordered a quart of cider a day. 2 others took an elixir vitriol 3 times a day, 25 drops. 2 others took 2 spoonfuls of vinegar 3 times a day. The worst patients, 2 of these were put on a course of seawater. 2 others each had 2 oranges and 1 lemon given to them every day. And the 2 remaining patients took what was called an electory, which is basically a sugar water, or maybe now what we would call a placebo. So after this experiment, he found that the individuals who saw the most sudden improvement in health were those who were exposed to a diet of oranges and lemons. And as you may know, as we know now, that's because of the effects of vitamin C that the sailors were receiving from the oranges and lemons. So this is really recorded as the first physician-driven clinical trial. So what are clinical trials? Here's some of the main premises behind them. So they're really research studies, and they explore whether a medical strategy, treatment, or device is effective for people. And these studies show which medical approach is best for certain illnesses or certain groups of people. For example, maybe a group of people with a certain type of cancer. Clinical trials do involve some type of intervention. That is, you're testing something, and it's different from simply providing health questionnaires for individuals to answer or doing chart review studies. Clinical trials are often one of the final stages of a long and careful research process. So if we take a look at the drug development cycle, research first starts out in a lab, often in various dishes, and then moves on to animals. And lastly, if the experiments look like they are safe and effective, we'll move into humans for the first time, which are clinical trials. The idea here is that clinical trials produce the best data available for us to make healthcare decisions. And we may find, this is important, that a new strategy, treatment, or device improves patient outcomes, provides no benefit at all, or it may actually cause unexpected harm. So that's really important for us to keep in mind with clinical trials. Is there's a variety of outcomes that may happen, but they are designed to be as safe as possible for people to participate, and with an obvious desire to minimize risk for people. So all of the results are important, whether they're positive, provide no benefit, or even the ones that do cause unexpected harm, because they really help us advance medical knowledge. And in the end, advancing medical knowledge helps us to improve patient care. So you may be familiar that there are phases to conducting clinical trials. And basically, only if only if the results of one phase are analyzed and deemed to be, I guess, successful, will the intervention move on to the next phase. So even though we've got these written down as a series of phases, there's no guarantee that when an intervention starts this journey through clinical trials, that it will reach the final phase. In this case, we've shown phase 4. So I'm going to briefly go through the phases here for you and talk a little bit about each one of them. So phase 0 trials are not always done. If they are done, they're very small, and they take a look at the effects the intervention has on the body. They will generally help people understand if the intervention should or should not go into a phase 1 trial. That's why they're very small. Phase 1 clinical trials are often looking at the safety of the intervention, how it will be given or how it will be dosed, and obviously side effects. And side effects are watched throughout all of the phases here. Phase 1 clinical trials tend to be a duration of a matter of weeks. They have a small number of participants that tend to be healthy, so usually between 20 to 80. However, in indications such as cancer, they sometimes will include people who have the cancer that's under study as well. Phase 2 studies are about, does the treatment do what it's supposed to do, or does it have an effect on for example, the disease that you're studying? So we take a look at if the dose needs to be changed, and again, the side effects. Phase 2 studies tend to have longer duration, so a matter of months, and they will have larger number of participants, in the hundreds typically. Phase 3 studies are taking a look at how long the effects of the intervention last. Again, side effects. This may be where we compare the intervention to current standards of therapy, and these tend to be longer studies, again, with durations of numbers of years. Again, we're looking at very large numbers of participants, in the thousands. So these are big studies. You can imagine also, as we kind of go through the phases, that potentially the cost is increasing as we go. Phase 4 studies are long-term studies. These typically happen after an intervention is being marketed and sold, so after approval by the regulatory agency. They're sometimes called post-marketing studies or post-marketing surveillance. So again, we're looking over a matter of years at people who are on the intervention to see effects, to observe effects over time in those individuals. So here we're looking at a large population because at this point the intervention has been approved and is being provided on the market. So we're looking at large numbers of people here. So those are the phases of clinical trials. In a nutshell, I've just put together this slide where we can take a look at how each clinical trial works. It's important to note that for clinical trials in Canada, they have to be approved by Health Canada, which is our regulatory agency, before the trial can begin. So Health Canada will look at the protocol and usually have some back and forth and some discussions with the sponsor before they okay it. There's selection of the investigator. The investigator is the person at a site that will be conducting the clinical trial. So they're in charge of what's happening at the site. There's an approval process there as well. And then participant recruitment can begin. So people can be consented to start the study. When the study is started and people are participating in it, a lot of data is collected and entered into some type of database and reviewed. Data analysis will happen, and when data analysis is taken a look at, there will be presentation and publication of results as well. And lastly, the data will be filed and registration is obtained. We'll come back to this a little bit later, but the main thing for you to think about here, there's obviously a number of steps for each clinical trial. And again, important that in Canada, like a number of other jurisdictions, the regulatory agency has to approve the protocol before the trial can begin. So who develops clinical trials or who develops protocols? So there's really a couple of different types. There's so-called industry-sponsored clinical trials, and that is where there's a company such as a pharmaceutical company, a medical device company, or a biotech company that is sponsoring. That means they are supporting the trial that's underway. And here the focus is developing treatments that improve health and well-being, and they will provide data to have products approved, so a new type of product approved for use, or sometimes these will be clinical trials that are undertaken to expand the use of an already approved product. So in the case of a drug therapy, potentially the drug has already been approved for one type of disease, and then it may undergo clinical trials to be approved for another type of disease or condition as well. So-called investigator-initiated clinical trials are the same types of clinical trials, but in this case, doctors and different healthcare providers and university professors are the ones that are starting the clinical trials and conducting them. And so here the focus is developing treatments, again, that improve health and well-being and that are about advancing science. So usually in this case, the person who, the investigator, has an interest in a type of, maybe it's a disease area, maybe it's a type of intervention. And they're, along with helping people who live with that disease, they're interested in advancing the science behind it too. In this case, in investigator-initiated trials, usually they're funded potentially by grants, for example, from funding agencies, or it might be through a health charity or through a patient organization, but they usually undergo a competitive type process to seek funding for this. So you can kind of think of a clinical trial protocol as kind of being like the recipe or the go-to book that has all the information about why the trial is being done, who it will involve, how it will be conducted, how results will be gathered, analyzed, and shared. So protocol is a critical component to conducting a clinical trial. And here are some of the typical parts of a clinical trial protocol. So what is the scientific or medical justification for the clinical trial? And it may also include data that's already been collected. So that may include what's called preclinical data, and that's data that's been collected in the lab and been collected with animal models. And in some cases, if there have been clinical trials done already, those results will also be part of this scientific medical justification. Other parts include key measurements for the trial. These are sometimes called endpoints. So maybe the trial is looking at how the rate of disease remission, the survival of participants in the study, quality of life, or side effects. And so those measurements are called endpoints. You may hear that sometimes. There's usually primary and secondary endpoints, so the main endpoints and then other endpoints that people are measuring as well. You may have also heard about eligibility or ineligibility criteria, or inclusion and exclusion criteria, and that is really defining who may participate in the trial and who can't participate in the trial. So for example, if we're looking at a therapeutic trial for a certain disease, just because someone has the disease does not mean that they can participate in the clinical trial. There will be other criteria that they will have to meet in order to be a participant. So the protocol will include that information. The protocol will also include the number of participants that are needed for the clinical trial and why that's the case. So there will have been done statistical analysis for how many people will be needed to prove the endpoints for the trial, and they will know in advance how many participants they will need to do that. Exactly what treatments will be used and how and if adjustments to treatment will be made will be detailed here. So-called assessments. So assessments will be when people have doctor's visits, will they have blood tests, will they answer questionnaires, will they need to have x-rays or other scans. All of those things are considered to be assessments. Those are measurements taken. There's safety reporting, so that all has to be collected in a specific manner for each trial, and the same goes for the data that will be collected. So there will be information on how this will be done, along with how results will be analyzed and shared, as well as the sample consent form for participants. So those are the typical parts of a clinical trial protocol. And as I mentioned, that's kind of, the protocol can be thought of as like the guidebook or the recipe book for the clinical trial itself. So how are investigators selected? It's important that the investigator who's in charge of the study has to be qualified to conduct the trial. So in the case of industry-sponsored trials, they are often conducted in many locations around the world, and they will select investigators based on a number of things. So for example, they'll look at the expertise that an investigator has. Sometimes you will hear the acronym KOL, or Key Opinion Leader. So these are often physicians in their field who are considered global experts, for example, in a certain disease area. And so often KOLs, or Key Opinion Leaders, are interested in conducting clinical trials, and they may be investigators for industry-sponsored trials. Industry will look at where they can get the trial started and finished most efficiently. So if it's going to take a really long time to negotiate contracts, to submit multiple research ethics applications versus in one jurisdiction versus getting a contract done quickly and having a more efficient REB process at another site. Those things might come into play for them when they make a decision about investigators that they select, where potential participants may be. So for example, there may be some sites where there's a large number of people with the same disease that's under study, and so that's a bit of a no-brainer in terms of where industry would conduct a trial. And importantly, industry usually looks at where they want to market their product and have participants from that jurisdiction be part of the clinical trials. In terms of investigator-initiated trials, for multi-site trials, which means they happen at different locations, investigators might access their own investigator network of other colleagues, for example, in other cities who might be willing to also undertake a trial at their location. In this case, cost may be a bigger issue because these are often funded by, like I said before, granting agencies, health charities, etc. So they might not have the same type of budget that an industry-sponsored trial may have. There are a lot of different approval processes for clinical trials, and that's important especially for people who are considering participation. As I mentioned earlier on in the webinar, a lot of work goes into trying to make clinical trials as safe as possible, given the certain risks that are out there for potential participants. So we've outlined them here. We've talked about this a little bit. There is regulatory approval that's required. So Health Canada has to receive and review clinical trial applications for pharmaceuticals, for biologics, medical devices, and natural health products. And clinical trials cannot proceed until Health Canada's approval is in place. That's important for you to know if you're considering participating. There's another layer of approval, and that's Research Ethics Board approval. So protocols and information that's provided to participants must be approved by an REB or a Research Ethics Board. And the REB focuses on the ethical acceptability of the research. So that's the risks and benefits and protecting the rights of participants. So that's the lens that the REB looks at the protocols and participant-facing information. And then the institutional approval, so the hospital or university approval. Each institution has to approve the research that's taking place within its own walls. That's important for a number of reasons. And so there's these various levels from Health Canada to the REB to the institutional approval for clinical trials to happen. Again, I'll just take you back to the little flow chart that we showed you before. So there's the approved protocol, there's investigator selection, the approval process related to that. Then there's participant recruitment, so people start to enter the trial, and as they do, their data is entered and reviewed. It's all very carefully done. And then there's data analysis, presentation, and publication of results, and the data being filed and registration being obtained. So that's kind of the first part, about a bit about the nuts and bolts of clinical trials. And now I'd like to move on a little bit to talk about participation, and if this is something you're considering, some of the things you should be aware of or that you might want to think about. So just to take you back again to the Engage strategic pillar from Clinical Trials Ontario. So again, we really want to encourage the active involvement of the public with respect to clinical trials. And again, as I mentioned earlier, that doesn't always mean as being participants, but it may just be simply about increasing public awareness of trials and having more of a discussion about clinical trials. I find we don't often do that. And we do want to support healthcare providers, and whether that's be with respect to having discussions with their patients about clinical trials, helping them find trials for their patients, or for some of them, they may even be interested in conducting trials, and so working with them in those capacities. So we're really aiming to help a broad stakeholder group, whether that's a patient, a person who lives with some type of condition, be it acute or chronic, the clinical trial participant, so helping them make an informed decision for themselves, and the public, quite frankly, because we think that clinical trials and research are such an important part of medical care, of health care, and about our citizens being healthier, that it's important that we have more conversations about clinical trials and research. So again, I'd like to come back to this concept that there are a number of things in place that help protect participants in a clinical trial. It's really up to you to be aware of these if you're considering participation, to think about these things, and quite honestly to ask a lot of questions if you're considering participating. So we've put some of these items here for you to think about and to know about, quite frankly. So we've talked quite a bit that clinical trials do have to follow set regulations and ethical standards. So that's important. The bar is high for those things for clinical trials to be approved to be conducted. Clinical trials have to be reviewed and approved by a research ethics board. And it's also important to know that once the trial is underway, the research ethics board also provides ongoing oversight. So they will periodically review the clinical trial and provide oversight. We've talked a lot about the protocol being that kind of guidebook or recipe book, and every clinical trial should have one that explains a lot of information about the trial. And as a participant, if that's of interest to you, you can certainly ask to see the protocol. Except for in a few unique cases, you will be asked to provide informed consent before the clinical trial starts. As I mentioned, there are some unique cases, for example, with respect to an emergency room clinical trial. In that case, you maybe wouldn't be provided, or you wouldn't be asked to provide informed consent before the trial, but you would certainly be asked for informed consent, and you could certainly decline, as you can in any case, if you're not interested in being part of the clinical trial. Steps are always taken to try to ensure confidentiality about participants. With everything, there's never a full guarantee, but confidentiality is a huge part of clinical trials and is an important aspect of it. So it's important as a participant that you know that. If you decide to participate in a clinical trial, and for any reason, if you feel it's no longer right for you, you can stop participating at any time. So again, that's a really important piece for you to think about. You may be asked for a reason why you no longer wish to continue participating, but honestly, you don't have to provide a reason if you don't wish to. So that, again, is really important to know that if you start a trial and for whatever reason you feel like it's not the right fit for you, you can decline participation at any time. So things that you might want to consider if you've been approached to volunteer to participate, some of the things you might think about is it's going to be up to you to be comfortable with potential benefits and risks that are potentially part of the clinical trial. And so it's important for you to have these explained to you in clear language that you understand. And quite honestly, if you don't understand them, you should ask about them and keep probing until you're comfortable with the answers that you receive. Are you happy with and do you understand the responses to the questions that you've asked about the clinical trial? So there should be no rush involved to talking to you about a clinical trial and about you taking your time to make a decision about it. We've talked a lot about the fact that there should be a protocol for clinical trials, so Do you know if there is one? And do you feel that you're able to make an informed decision about your participation? So do you know what you're getting into? Do you understand the risks and benefits? Do you understand the expectations of you as a participant enough to make an informed decision about your participation? This is also really important. Are you comfortable with and trust the healthcare provider or research team that you're working with? So you might have a lot of interactions with them. The trial might be short or it might be longer. But again, it's really important for you to be comfortable with those individuals, to have trust in them, and to be comfortable enough to ask any kind of questions at any point that you feel you need answered. The last question here is, have you been asked to pay to participate in a clinical trial? There are often small expenses that you'll have to pay for as a participant. For example, you may have to pay for parking when you go for a doctor's visit. You may have to pay to get yourself there. Depending on how close the trial is to you or how far away, those costs can be very different. But these are things that you should be asking when you're approached about being a participant. It is important for you to know that you should not be asked for a fee to simply participate in the clinical trial itself. So if that is something that comes up, that should be a flag for you, and you should be asking questions about that. So those are some of the things you may wish to consider if you're approached or if you're considering asking about being a participant in a clinical trial. Lastly, we often are asked, how do I find a trial? And so we've got a few pointers here for you, realizing that these may be different for different people, and you may need to ask for some help. So probably a good step would be to talk to your healthcare provider. They may be able to help you, or they may be able to point you in a direction where someone can help you. You may wish to contact an organization that could also help you find a trial. And by organization, that might be a health charity, that may be a patient organization, a group that's interested in trials and that may have the resources to help you find something appropriate. You might choose to search a website. So given that today's webinar is with the Canadian Cancer Survivor Network, there is www.canadiancancertrials.ca, and then there is a Health Canada clinical trials website, and there is www.clinicaltrials.gov. Most clinical trials are entered into clinicaltrials.gov. The ones that are taking place in Canada should be part of the Health Canada site. Sometimes these can be a little bit difficult to navigate, and there are patient organizations and health charities that can help you navigate these as well. But these are some ideas in case you would like to search a website. And if you live in an area where there's an academic research center, you may contact that research center and see if they have studies and trials going on in a particular area of interest for you. And generally people are happy to help you get to a person who can potentially help you out. Lastly, I've just got our contact information, including my contact information here, and Clinical Trials Ontario's information. And if you're not comfortable asking questions today, don't worry about it at all. I'm happy to receive an email from you and get back to you at another time. And I think that wraps up my presentation portion, and I'm happy to pass it back to Jared so we can hear from the clinical trial participants who are anxiously waiting to talk to you. So
Yes, I'm sure they are.
For your attention.
Thanks so much, Dawn. That was fantastic, and I'm sure we have lots to discuss now. I just want to remind the audience that if they have questions, you can send them in through the panel on the right side. It may be a little complicated, but there are already a few, so I see that some people are getting it figured out. And we'll be asking those questions we'll direct those questions to the panel and to the presenter in a few minutes, but right now it's time to introduce our panel. So first up we have Eric Pitters. Eric, are you around?
I'm here.
Fantastic. Could you give us maybe a bit of a rundown on yourself and your experience with clinical trials? Just a quick one.
Sure. I have CLL, chronic lymphocytic leukemia. I was diagnosed in 2005, went through watch and wait. And in 2007, I was referred to PMH by my oncologist because there wasn't a lot of treatments at the time for me. And I joined a clinical trial that Don referred to, which was a trial involving Revlimid or lenalidomide. This was a drug that was used for multiple myeloma, and they were doing a test with it for CLL, and I was on that drug for 7 years. In 2014, I had a few treatments with FCR, which is the gold standard, 4 treatments in fact, and now it's 2017. I need treatment again, and I am hopefully on Monday I'll find out I'll be entered into a new clinical trial regarding acalabrutinib.
All right. And next we have James Davidson. James, are you there?
Yes. James, did you say James, Jared?
I said James.
Yep, I'm here. I'm a lymphoma patient. I have mantle cell lymphoma. It's a form of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. I was diagnosed in 2005, similar to Eric. I did high-dose chemotherapy in 2007, 2008. Hyper-CVAD was the regime I did, and also BEAM, which some may have heard of. And then that was followed by an autologous stem cell transplant, my own stem cells, in March of 2008. And then I was more or less symptom-free, tumor-free through until about 2011. And then I did a different type of chemotherapy at that time. I needed new treatment. That I did the drug gemcitabine by IV injection in the hospital. Every for a total of 6 months, 1 treatment a month or so. That was not a clinical trial. Then that allowed me to be more or less treatment-free through until 2014. And then in 2014 and 15, I did a clinical trial with a drug called ibrutinib. I don't know if that was the one Eric mentioned, but anyway, I did a clinical trial, 4 capsules per day that I took just at home. And that went on for about a year. And then by that time, my doctors had concluded, and I agreed, that it seemed as though the drug had done all that it could do for me. And so that was the end of the clinical trial that I was involved in. And then about 2 years later, in 2016, I did another drug, bendamustine, for 6 months. That was not a clinical trial. I received that by IV in the hospital, an IV treatment once a month. And that since then I have been in remission, and still am in remission. And so right now, hoping that my remission continues. But again, my clinical trial experience was with the drug ibrutinib for about a year in 2014.
All right, thanks very much, James. I'm going to pass it on to Kathie LaForge now. Sorry, we're getting a little clicking there. Kathie, can you unmute yourself?
Yes, I can.
Beautiful, thank you. Sorry, if you guys are getting a little typing in the background, that's just my office mate.
Yeah, no worries. So my name's Kathie LaForge. I'm from central British Columbia, Vanderhoof, BC, and I was diagnosed with stage 3 colorectal cancer in 2013. I had surgery and then had chemo that involved a drug called oxyplatin, and I developed chemo-induced peripheral neuropathy as a result of that drug. And I guess in a number of cases that neuropathy goes away after sort of a 2-year period. well, it didn't for me, and since 2014 I've tried massage therapy, acupuncture, various drugs, Cymbalta, venlafaxine, gabapentin, methadone, cannabis oil, and none have really produced much in the way of results in terms of reducing the pain I experience from the neuropathy. So I have just found out about a clinical trial that the BC Cancer is involved in, and they're going to be testing randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled crossover trial of the use of subcutaneous lidocaine infusion for chronic cancer-related pain. And now I have a bit more information on that whole study. I'm not sure if this is the time to go into it now. I've just had sort of an introductory couple of meetings, and my first treatment won't be until next Wednesday, so I'm pretty early in this process.
Okay, and I mean, I have a question mostly for all of the people participating, but mostly for specific people on the panel. How did you feel going into these clinical trials? Was it a scary experience? Can we start with Eric?
Yeah, sure. Very briefly, I was a IT salesperson all my life, and the reason I bring that up is that I found out that with those sales that I had some control in, I had a pretty good chance of winning them, and those that I didn't have any control in, I lost. So you can imagine the fear I was told when I had leukemia. And so the way I overcame this fear was to learn as much as I could about the disease as possible. And so when it came to clinical trials, I did the same thing. Now, most of the drugs that are here in Canada, when I was offered the first clinical trial, I couldn't even get in to find out where the hell where the trials were. So I opted to go to the NCI website in the United States, and typically, in my experience, that all the trial information is there. The studies, the results are all there, and I was able to make a pretty informed decision. So what I did was I learned as much as I could, including reference to doctors' conferences by my hematologist, to learn as much as I could, and therefore take that worry away from me, and as well as much as I could from my family and wife.
Thanks, Eric. James and Kathy, would you like to weigh in on that?
Yeah, one of the things I was going to say is I was not worried either. I was, let's say, a little bit anxious maybe to begin with, but similar to Eric, what I found that really helped me was studying the drug, the proposed trial, speaking a great deal with my hematologist, my doctor, who was just fantastic with exchange of information and details about what might be expected by way of symptoms, what might be expected by way of results, achieving results, the risks, all of that. So the full discussion to me with the hematologist is what really put my mind at ease and made me feel comfortable going into the clinical trial.
Kathy, would you like to?
I agree with that as well.
Yes, so in my case, I didn't have any fear really with regard to the trial. I had, I guess, a feeling of hope more than fear. Lidocaine is used already in the management of non-cancer related pain, so I sort of felt like, well, the drug's pretty safe probably, and so it's just a matter of this intravenous technique that they're using. And to be honest, I think the biggest factor is trying to have a trial that is in a controlled setting that will convince Health Canada that they should approve the use of lidocaine to treat this type of pain I'm experiencing. So if I can help in that way, I'm very keen.
Okay, well, thank you so much for that, those answers, guys. Those were well thought and great. We're actually going to move on to the audience questions now, as there seem to be quite a few of them. So we'll start with this one from Peter Dorfman, and this is probably going to be mostly addressed to Dawn. Is Canada, he asks, is Canada an important center for clinical trials? Is there a stat that ranks the number of trials by country? I ask because pharmas have said that there will be fewer trials if they're obliged to stop or to drop drug prices.
Okay, that's a great question. I don't have stats at my fingertips about, trials in the number of trials in Canada, or where we kind of, I'll say, rank within the setting. I think that the important thing here, and it's something that's on the mind of a lot of clinical trials organizations, as well as investigators and sponsors, is making, I'll say, Canada competitive in the clinical trial space. So we hear a lot that we do a great job of doing clinical research with respect to data gathering and just the quality of our researchers. I think some of the hurdles that we have heard about is, in some cases, trial startup, and that is a big reason why Clinical Trials Ontario has done a lot of work with respect to streamlining the multi-site ethics review. Sometimes contract negotiations, especially again at multi-sites, can go on for extended periods. So there's a real, I guess, strategy, and there's a real knowledge around the fact that we need to make Canada more competitive in some of these areas with respect to logistics, not on the side of can we do good and high quality trials. So I apologize, it doesn't exactly answer your question, but there are real efforts going into making Canada very competitive in this space.
So this next question is from Andrew Choate, who asks, why can we not have a published profile that identifies our willingness to be contacted about trials?
And sorry, who is that being asked to, Jared?
Oh, sorry. I was asking it to you, I guess, Dawn.
Okay. So a published profile as an individual, I guess?
Yeah, I guess it's sort of like a, it would be more of like a LinkedIn maybe for clinical trials.
Right. So there are some, I'll call them clinical trial registries that, for example, some patient organizations and charities have been working really hard to develop. I can think of the Foundation Fighting Blindness is one of them. The Huntington Society, I don't think has an actual registry, but they have a lot of people enrolled in an observational study that could be also that probably tapped on for clinical trials. So there are forums like that. There's not kind of like a Facebook for clinical trials that I am aware of, but there are also organizations that do match you to clinical trials, or I can also think of the Michael J. Fox Foundation in the U.S. with respect to Parkinson's. You can sign up and share a willingness to participate and then be contacted for clinical trials. There are also, in some hospital systems in Canada, there's something called permission to contact. So when you enter the hospital system at any point, you are actually asked for your permission to contact you if at another period in time you become eligible for a study that's happening at that center. So again, doesn't exactly answer your question about creating a profile and making it very public, but depending on the disease area that you're interested in, there are some of those efforts underway, and I would be happy to be contacted offline if there's a specific area that you're interested in to see if I could help you out there.
All right, this question here is from Diana Marino, who asks, and this will be for the panel as well as Dawn, What is the role of a patient or patient advocate in the development of clinical trials? How can we get involved? So first I'm going to actually throw this to the panel and maybe just reframe the question and ask, did you guys feel as though you were involved, and how did you get involved? Like, how did you get involved?
Well,
Sorry.
Now, maybe I can start on that, Jared, if it's okay.
Sure.
I got involved really because I was at a point where I needed treatment, and so it was in consultation with my doctor, my hematologist. She was aware of the clinical trial. That's how it came to me, and so it all seemed sort of natural to me. It was one of the options, one of the treatment options available. Together, we concluded that it was a good option for me. And the advantage, of course, of a clinical trial is not only that it may help the patient themselves, but it may help others. And so for all of those reasons, I was, the clinical trial made sense for me.
Don, is there a way for patients to get the ball rolling on clinical trials in their area? How can they get involved in that way, like in the development of them? Can they?
Yeah, they absolutely can. There's a real, I'll say, variety of ways. So there is a movement in Canada and globally to undertake more so-called patient-oriented research. In Canada, this has really been spearheaded by the Canadian Institutes for Health Research, or CIHR. And there are various ways for individual patients to be, I'll say, a patient collaborator on research projects, some of them being clinical trials. This is something that CTO is really interested in helping the community in Ontario and beyond to work with patients, again, as collaborators. We're very respectful that patients live with their disease day in and day out, and they have what I call lived experience with their disease to help inform the creation of, I'll say, hopefully better studies that result in better outcomes for patients. So we're starting to work in that area, and there are other organizations that are doing this. Again, in the health charity and patient organization space, the Canadian Colorectal Cancer Group hosted a large workshop back in June, and they brought together patient organizations, industry, academic investigators, and we had real conversations there about in cancer in Canada, how can we better involve patients in the development of studies. So it's a movement that's starting. Again, I could go on for a long time about a number of different examples. Again, I'm happy to be contacted. My email address is there to help you if you're interested in learning more about it or finding a group to work with in that capacity.
So the next part, we only have a time for a few more questions, it looks like, but I'll try to get as many as we can. Dennis Maurice and Georgetta Dumitris asked us sort of a similar question. If I get offered money to participate, should I accept? And I'll ask Dawn first.
I think, I can't say yes or no. Again, that's part of you as a potential participant deciding if you feel informed about the study. So quite honestly, there are organizations that will pay healthy individuals to be part of early phase studies. And so that's a decision that's up to an individual to make. If they feel like they've done their homework, they trust what's going on, they feel like it's a legitimate study, then, it's up to the individual to make an informed decision. And, like I said, in some cases with healthy individuals, that does happen. So it's not unheard of, but again, that's an individual decision that has to be made.
All right, this next question is from Fred Ho, and it's for the panelists. Did any of the panelists encounter accessibility or affordability issues continuing on with their drug protocol once their clinical trial was finished?
I can handle that. It's Eric Pitters here. Once the trial is finished, typically, in my experience, the trial was only a 2-year study, and I was on the drug for 7 years. Typically, the drug company will offer the drug as long as it's effective, and there won't be any charge for it.
Yeah, it's James. I'll offer a comment to that effect too, just to confirm that that was the same arrangement under my clinical trial, which was that the drug would be supplied by the pharmaceutical firm, and as long as it was felt to be of use or helpful. And so there was no question about accessibility to it or expense, no concern in that regard at all. Of course, until the trial was over, which was the time when the drug didn't seem to be of any use anymore to me.
And in my situation, I'm told that if, in fact, this drug does make a difference for me, that they'll make every effort to try to make it accessible for me without payment, like being sponsored somehow.
Okay, well, we're running low on time, so I am going to pass it back to Mona to make our last statements and our outro here. Mona, are you there?
Yes, I am. Thank you, Jared. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Don, Eric, James, and Kathy for your participation today. It was very much appreciated. I found the interaction very interesting. We especially like to thank Amgen, Boehringer Ingelheim, Merck, and Novartis for their support of today's and many other of our webinars. I'm a little concerned about those unanswered questions, and perhaps Dawn, we could send you those questions that were unanswered so people would be able to get some information from you. Stay tuned to our website and sign up for our e-letter for other opportunities for participation in things that are going on and to join our webinars. And just a reminder, this webinar will be available online tomorrow. There will be a full video on YouTube as well as slides, which will be on our SlideShare account. Links to both will be sent out tomorrow afternoon. Thank you for attending, and we all hope you have a wonderful rest of the afternoon.